Shadows of Tomorrow by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Graveyard. The town of Hollowford wore shadows like an old coat. At the edges, where forests twisted around forgotten buildings and murky creeks choked the air with damp, Hollowford lay as though suspended in a memory. The people who remained told stories of better days, days when factories hummed with life, and the streets weren't lined with cracked pavement or overgrown weeds. Now, only whispers filled the air, murmurs that sank into the bones of anyone still wandering Hollowford's narrow streets. Sam Rivers was used to those whispers. At 15, he knew Hollowford as well as anyone who called it home, but even he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched every time he passed the old town hall. The building loomed at the center of town, its shutters drooping, its once proud columns chipped and weathered. People avoided it, and rightly so, for what the town didn't speak of openly, it hinted at in passing glances and hurried footsteps. That was Hollowford, where secrets weren't kept so much as lived. But Sam had his own secret. He held a folded piece of paper, its edges frayed, in his pocket, a map he'd found buried among his father's things. The map was marked with a strange symbol near the cemetery. And tonight, with the moon slung low in the sky, he was going to find whatever it led to. Sam's friends waited for him in the alley near the old bakery. Lena was leaning against the wall, one leg crossed over the other, while Nico fiddled with a flashlight. Jasper was absent-mindedly tossing a rock back and forth between his hands, as though keeping his fingers busy could still his restless mind. "You sure about this, Sam?" Lena asked as he approached. Her voice held a mix of apprehension and excitement, a blend Sam recognized well. "Only one way to find out," Sam replied, clutching the map a little tighter. He looked around at them, each of them bound to Hollowford by their own ghosts. I mean, who wouldn't want to go digging in an abandoned graveyard at midnight? Jasper cracked a grin, tossing the rock into the darkness. "Let's get going then." They walked through the town in silence, the only sounds their muffled footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. When they reached the iron gates of the graveyard, Sam felt his pulse quicken. The cemetery was ancient, overgrown with wild ivy and tangled branches. Headstones leaned and crumbled as if the weight of Hollowford's history had pressed them into the ground. Sam unfolded the map and traced a line from the entrance to a forgotten corner shaded by a sprawling oak tree. The map showed an X just a few feet beyond, near a headstone so old its inscription had been weathered away. "It's here," Sam whispered, nodding toward the ground. "Let's start digging." Jasper and Nico grabbed the small shovels they'd brought, and Lena held the flashlight, her hands steady despite the uneasy look in her eyes. The earth was damp, smelling of moss and rot. Each shovelful seemed to echo in the stillness around them, as though the graveyard itself was waking, stirring at the intrusion. After what felt like hours but could have only been minutes, their shovels struck something hard. Sam knelt, brushing dirt away with his hands until he uncovered the lid of a metal box. It was old, rusted, and marked with symbols he didn't recognize. "Here it is," he murmured, glancing at the others, who had gathered around, leaning in, to see. The time capsule. Lena tilted the flashlight down, illuminating the box. "It doesn't look like anything I've ever seen." Nico wiped his hands on his jeans, studying it closely. "It's almost too well preserved," he said, his voice hushed, "like it's been waiting here, untouched." Sam's heart pounded as he reached for the latch, his fingers trembling slightly. With a faint click, the latch released, and he slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay objects that shouldn't have belonged in a forgotten graveyard, or in Hollowford at all. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Future. The lid creaked as it opened, releasing a faint, metallic smell that mingled with the damp air of the graveyard. Sam held his breath, peering inside, the others crowding close to catch a glimpse. The contents of the capsule were baffling. Nestled in the rusted box as though waiting to be found, lay a strange assortment of objects that looked foreign, out of place, wrong. First was a slim silver device that seemed to glow faintly, with no buttons or screen, just a smooth surface that felt unnaturally warm in Sam's hand. Beneath it was a small notebook, its cover smeared with what looked suspiciously like dried blood. As he turned it over, he felt a pang of recognition. There, scrawled on the bottom corner in faint handwriting, was Lena's name. "What is that?" Lena asked, noticing Sam's alarmed look. She leaned forward, her face pale. Why? Why is my name on it? Sam didn't know how to answer. He passed her the notebook, and she clutched it tightly, her face twisted with a mixture of fear and confusion. That's not all, Nico whispered, pulling out a folded piece of thick yellowed paper tucked beneath the device. He opened it carefully, revealing a map of Hollowford. But this wasn't just any map. It was Hollowford, yet. Look, Nico said, pointing to landmarks marked in bright red ink. The Blackwood Mill, the town hall, and the factory on the edge of town. It's like some kind of warning. The red ink around each location seemed to pulse under the flashlight, the lines almost shimmering. Hollowford's landmarks were marked with dates, some of them crossed out, others circled with dark, aggressive strokes. A few had skull symbols beside them, while others had words like flood and fire scratched in harsh letters. At the bottom of the map was a single line, written in a jagged hand, "The day of flood and fire will come for Hollowford." "What's the date today?" Sam asked, his voice barely a whisper. "October 12th, Jasper replied, frowning. He squinted at one of the dates circled in red ink. "The 13th is marked here. That's tomorrow." The group fell silent, each processing the implication. It wasn't just eerie, it was terrifying. Someone, somewhere, had left this message, but from where? And more chillingly, from when? "It doesn't make sense," Lena said finally, flipping through the notebook's pages. They were filled with more of her name, scrawled alongside other strange phrases. "Only the shadows know, don't trust the light, and the end will begin at the mill." "It's like a nightmare," she muttered. "A sick joke." Sam shook his head, trying to make sense of the swirling unease that filled him. "What if it's not a joke?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What if someone wanted us to find this?" They all looked at him, the unease growing in their eyes. "What are you saying?" Nico asked, his voice trembling slightly. Sam swallowed hard. "I'm saying, what if this is from the future? What if someone sent it back to warn us?" Jasper snorted, though it sounded forced. "Yeah, right. Like someone sent this time capsule to save Hollowford?" Sam met his gaze, unflinching. "Then how do you explain Lena's name, or the date, or this map that shows the town as if something terrible's about to happen?" Jasper fell silent, his bravado draining away. "Look," Sam continued, his tone steady despite the fear churning inside him. "I don't know who sent this or why, but I think we have to follow it, see where it leads." "Are you serious?" Lena asked, gripping the blood-stained notebook. Her hands were trembling. "You really want us to go where this map says? To the places marked with skulls?" Sam nodded, a strange calm settling over him. "If there's even a chance this is real, then maybe we can stop whatever's coming. Maybe we can save Hollowford." Silence fell over them as they weighed his words. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional creak from the old cemetery gate swinging in the wind. Finally, Nico spoke up, his voice wavering. "I'm in. It's insane, but I'm in." Lena nodded reluctantly. "Me too. I have to know why my name is here." Jasper sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Fine, but if this turns out to be some elaborate prank, I swear." "Tomorrow," Sam interrupted, "we'll start with the first location marked on the map, the Blackwood Mill." The mention of the mill sent a shiver through each of them. Hollowford's Blackwood Mill was a place even the boldest kids avoided. Stories of accidents and shadows moving in the night haunted its crumbling walls. But they couldn't turn back now. They agreed to meet the following night, each returning home with a heavy heart and 1,000 questions they couldn't answer. And as Sam walked home alone, the map burned in his pocket like a warning he couldn't ignore. In the distance, the town of Hollowford lay under the midnight sky, dark and quiet, unaware of the shadows that had begun to stir. Chapter 3. The Blackwood Mill. The next night, Hollowford was blanketed in thick, oppressive fog. Streetlights cast weak halos through the mist, their glow swallowed by the darkness as if the night itself was conspiring to keep secrets hidden. Sam shivered, his heart pounding as he approached the agreed-upon meeting spot near the edge of town. The others were already waiting, faces pale and tense in the cold night air. "Ready?" Sam whispered, though he already knew the answer from the uneasy glances exchanged among his friends. Nico clutched his flashlight tightly, and Lena kept her hand on the notebook as though it were a lifeline. Jasper stood off to the side, expression unreadable, his usual bravado replaced with something closer to dread. No one spoke as they made their way through the winding streets toward the Blackwood Mill. The mill loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and unnatural against the misty night. Once a place of industry, it had been abandoned for decades, left to decay under layers of rust and ivy. Rumor had it that workers had perished in an explosion years ago, and that their souls still haunted the grounds. Sam had never been one to believe in ghost stories, but tonight felt different. They reached the gates and paused, staring up at the looming structure. The mill was a skeleton, its towering frame twisted and decayed. Shattered windows gaped like hollow eyes, and the air was thick with the smell of mold and rot. It was hard to imagine this place had once been a symbol of prosperity, its machinery clanking and churning with life. Now it was just another corpse in Hollowford's graveyard of memories. "This place gives me the creeps," Nico muttered, tightening his grip on the flashlight. "I mean more than usual." "Me too," Lena whispered. Her fingers traced over the spine of the notebook, as if searching for answers in its pages. "But we have to see this through. There's something here. I can feel it." Sam nodded, steeling himself. "Let's head inside. Stay close and keep your voices down." They slipped through a break in the gate and entered the mill grounds, moving quietly as their footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement. The fog seemed thicker here, swirling in ghostly tendrils around the old machinery that lay rusting in the yard. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, but whenever they looked directly, there was nothing there, only the eerie emptiness. They approached the mill's entrance, a set of double doors hanging askew on broken hinges. Sam pushed one open, and it groaned loudly, echoing through the empty building like a warning. They stepped inside, immediately overwhelmed by the stifling air. Dust hung thickly, and every breath tasted of decay. Inside, the mill was a labyrinth of broken machinery and twisted metal. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional creak of wood or the distant drip of water. It felt as though they had stepped into another world, one where time had stopped, leaving only shadows in its wake. "What are we even looking for?" Jasper asked, his voice low. It was the first time he had spoken since they'd arrived. Sam pulled out the map and pointed to a red X marked near the back of the building. "According to this, it should be somewhere in the storage area. Let's keep going." They moved cautiously, winding their way through narrow corridors lined with crumbling walls and shattered windows. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the building itself were alive, watching them with unseen eyes. Suddenly, Lena stopped, her flashlight illuminating a set of footprints in the dust. They were fresh, leading deeper into the mill. "Someone else has been here recently," she whispered, her voice tinged with fear. "Or, someone's here right now," Nico added, his face pale. They pressed on, following the footprints. The path led them down a corridor that opened into a large storage room filled with abandoned crates and tangled chains hanging from the ceiling. It was colder here, the chill seeping through their clothes, gnawing at their skin. Sam's flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. "There." Lena pointed to a dark shape in the corner, a small chest, similar to the one they'd found in the graveyard, its surface covered in strange symbols that glinted faintly in the light. The hairs on the back of Sam's neck prickled. This was it. They gathered around the chest, and Sam knelt to examine it. His fingers traced the symbols, feeling their strange, almost electric pulse under his skin. It was as if the chest were alive, breathing, waiting. "Are we really going to open this?" Jasper asked, his voice barely audible. "We came this far," Sam replied, swallowing his fear. "We have to know." He reached for the latch, his heart pounding. The metal was cold, almost painfully so, but he forced himself to pull it open. Inside the chest lay another set of objects, each more unnerving than the last. The first was a small vial filled with a dark liquid that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. Sam held it up, watching the strange way it seemed to absorb the darkness, as though it were a piece of the night itself. Next to the vial was a photograph, its edges frayed. Sam's stomach dropped as he recognized the faces in the picture. Himself, Lena, Nico, and Jasper standing outside the mill, just as they were now. But something was wrong. In the photo, they looked older. Their faces were lined with fear, their eyes hollow, and behind them, the mill was engulfed in flames. Scrawled across the photo in a hasty, almost frantic hand were the words, "Time is running out." What does this mean? Lena whispered, clutching the photo tightly, her knuckles white. "It means we're running out of time," Nico replied, his voice shaking. "Whatever disaster is coming, it's close, closer than we thought." They stared at the photo, their minds racing with questions. How had the chest ended up here? Who had left it? And most chillingly, why did it feel as though they were being watched, their every move observed by eyes they couldn't see? As they stood there, the silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps echoing from the corridor they had just come from. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. "We need to hide," Sam whispered urgently, his heart racing. He grabbed the chest, tucking it under his arm as they scattered, ducking behind crates and piles of debris. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they could see the outline of a figure moving slowly through the doorway. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the shadows. He wore a long coat that brushed the ground as he moved, his head turning as though searching for something, or someone. Sam held his breath, watching as the man scanned the room. His gaze lingered on the spot where they had stood just moments before, his eyes narrowing. Then, as if sensing something, he turned, his eyes falling on the corner where Sam was hiding. Sam's heart pounded as the man's gaze seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto him. But then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving only the sound of his footsteps echoing down the corridor. They waited, breaths held, until the sound faded. Only then did they dare to emerge from their hiding spots, their faces pale and shaken. "We have to leave," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than us." Sam nodded, clutching the chest tightly. "We'll figure this out later. Right now, let's just get out of here." They hurried back through the mill, the darkness pressing in around them as they retraced their steps. But as they reached the exit, a chill ran down Sam's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And as they stepped out into the night, Hollowford felt darker than ever. Chapter 4: Shadows in the Fog. The next day dawned over Hollowford with a heaviness that seemed to settle into every corner of the town. The mist lingered, clinging to the crooked streets and old buildings like a shroud, as though the very air itself had taken on the secrets they were beginning to uncover. Sam sat on the edge of his bed, the events of the night before replaying in his mind in an endless, uneasy loop. The strange man in the mill, the photo of their future selves, and those words scrawled across it. "Time is running out." Every detail seemed to echo with a warning he couldn't ignore. The chest they'd found was now hidden under his bed, out of sight but never out of mind. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message from Lena. "Meet us by the park. We need to talk." Sam shoved the phone in his pocket, grabbed his jacket, and headed out, bracing himself against the chill in the air. The streets were eerily empty, and even the sounds of birds and distant traffic felt muted, as if the whole town were holding its breath. By the time he reached the park, the others were already there, huddled together near an old, weathered bench beneath the twisted branches of an oak tree. Nico looked tired, shadows under his eyes, and Jasper kept glancing over his shoulder, his usual swagger replaced by something more guarded. "We need to go back to the mill," Lena said, getting straight to the point. "We barely scratched the surface last night. I think there's more to find." Jasper scoffed, crossing his arms. "Are you out of your mind? That place is dangerous. And that guy we saw, he was looking for something, or someone." "Exactly," Lena replied, unfazed. "And he didn't find us. But what if he's connected to all of this? What if he's part of whatever disaster is coming? If we don't figure this out, we're just sitting ducks." Sam nodded. "I agree. We can't just ignore what we found. That photo, it's a warning, but it's also proof that whatever's coming, we might be able to stop it. But we have to keep looking." Nico sighed, glancing nervously at the sky. "Fine, but let's be smart about this. We'll need supplies. Flashlights, maybe something to defend ourselves with. If we're going back in, we have to be ready." The group split up to gather what they needed, agreeing to meet again that night. Sam spent the rest of the day in a haze of preparation and dread, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that their every move was being watched, that the secrets they were uncovering were leading them closer to a danger none of them truly understood. As night fell, they regrouped at the park, their flashlights and supplies packed tightly into their bags. The mill loomed in the distance, an ominous shadow against the darkening sky. None of them spoke as they made their way back through the empty streets, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. When they reached the mill, Sam paused, feeling a strange pull in his chest, as though the building itself were calling him back. He pushed the feeling aside and led the way through the broken gate, his flashlight casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, the mill was as eerie as they had left it, but now there was a new tension in the air, a feeling of something lurking just beyond their sight. They retraced their steps, moving cautiously through the narrow corridors and broken machinery until they reached the storage room where they had found the chest. But this time, the room wasn't empty. The strange man was there, standing in the center of the room with his back to them, his long coat brushing the ground. He seemed to be examining something on the wall, his fingers tracing invisible patterns as though deciphering a code. Sam felt his heart skip a beat, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run. But Lena took a step forward, her voice low but steady. "Who are you?" The man froze, his hand hovering in midair. Slowly he turned to face them, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His face was gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow, as though life itself had drained from him long ago. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to echo through the room. "You're meddling in things you cannot understand." Sam swallowed, his throat dry. "We found the capsule. We saw the photo. We know something bad is coming to Hollowford, and we're trying to stop it." The man's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You think you can stop what's coming? Foolish children. The events set in motion cannot be undone. Time is a river, and once the currents flow, they cannot be diverted." "Who are you?" Jasper demanded, stepping forward. "Are you the one who left that capsule? What's going to happen to this town?" The man's gaze shifted to Jasper, his eyes dark and piercing. "I am merely a shadow, a watcher of the cycles that bind this place. Hollowford is cursed, bound by the sins of those who came before, and now it will pay the price." Lena clutched the notebook, her voice trembling. "We saw the map, the flood and fire. What does it mean?" The man took a step closer, his face etched with something that looked almost like pity. "The flood and fire are merely symbols, child. They represent a reckoning, a cleansing of the rot that festers in Hollowford's heart. When the day comes, everything you know will be swept away, burned to ashes, and there is nothing you can do to stop it." Sam clenched his fists, anger flaring in his chest. "There has to be a way. If the capsule was meant to warn us, then there must be a way to prevent it." The man's eyes flickered, his expression softening for a brief moment. "The capsule was a message, but not for you. It was meant for those who knew the truth, those who could have stopped the decay before it began. But you are mere children, trapped in a web spun long before your time." Lena took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper. "But we have to try. Please, tell us what we can do." The man looked at her, a trace of something like sorrow flickering in his eyes. "There is one way," he said slowly, "but it will require a great sacrifice." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Sam felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to hold the man's gaze. "What sacrifice?" The man's gaze hardened, his face shadowed in the dim light. "The mill holds the heart of Hollowford's curse. There is a place beneath this building, an old foundation where the first of the town's sins were laid. It is there that the cycle was born, and it is there that it can be broken." He paused, his voice low and dangerous. "But once you enter, there is no guarantee you will return. You may face things beyond your darkest nightmares, shadows that do not wish to be disturbed." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of the man's words settling over them like a dark cloud. But Sam felt a strange, fierce determination rising in his chest. If there was a chance to save Hollowford, no matter how slim, he had to take it. "We'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "Tell us how to get to this foundation." The man's eyes narrowed, a look of both respect and sorrow in his gaze. "Very well, follow me." He turned and led them through the mill, down a narrow, twisting stairwell that seemed to descend forever into the depths of the earth. The air grew colder, and the darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. Finally, they reached the bottom, where a heavy iron door barred their way. The man paused, resting a hand on the door as though listening to the silence beyond. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Beyond this door lies the heart of Hollowford's curse. Face it, if you dare, but know that once you cross this threshold, there is no turning back." With that, he pushed the door open, revealing a cavernous, shadow-filled chamber beyond. Sam took a deep breath, steeling himself as he stepped forward, his friends following close behind. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing them in darkness, and as they took their first steps into the chamber, they felt the weight of centuries bearing down upon them, the shadows shifting, watching, waiting. They had entered the heart of the curse, and now there was no escape. Chapter 5: Into the Depths. The air in the chamber was heavy, thick with a musty scent that felt ancient, as though it had been trapped and stagnant for centuries. Sam held his flashlight out in front of him, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness to reveal damp stone walls lined with strange carvings. The symbols twisted and spiraled, seeming to pulse and move as the light passed over them. He shuddered, fighting the urge to turn and run. The others were just as tense, their faces illuminated in the dim glow of their flashlights, eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. Lena ran her fingers over the carvings, her expression distant as if trying to decode their meaning. "These symbols," she whispered, "they look familiar, somehow." Jasper scoffed, though his voice was shaky. "Right, because ancient curses and creepy symbols are, totally normal." "Keep it down," Nico muttered. His usual bravado had faded, and now he scanned the shadows as though expecting something to lunge from the dark. "Whatever's down here, we don't want it to hear us coming." The four of them pressed onward, moving slowly through the twisting corridors of the chamber. The further they went, the more the carvings covered the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, spiraling in patterns that made Sam's head swim if he looked at them too long. Finally, they entered a large circular room with a domed ceiling that stretched high above, lost in the darkness. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface cracked and stained with dark patches that looked disturbingly like blood. Around the altar were tall, jagged stones arranged in a circle, their surfaces etched with even more of the cryptic symbols. Lena's voice broke the silence. This must be it, the foundation he was talking about. Sam felt a chill settle over him as he approached the altar, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. There was a strange energy here, a feeling of something powerful and malevolent waiting just beneath the surface. He glanced back at his friends, their faces pale and fearful but resolute. "What now?" Jasper asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know, but if this is where Hollowford's curse started, then maybe there's something here we can use to break it." Lena stepped forward, pulling out the notebook they'd found in the capsule. She flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she scanned the words. "There are notes here," she murmured. "Warnings about awakened shadows and offerings to seal the curse. It's like instructions, but they don't make sense." "What kind of offerings?" Nico asked, his voice tight. Lena's face paled as she read the words aloud. "To cleanse the curse, a life must be given back. One must become a shadow bound to the place where the darkness began." She looked up, horror in her eyes. It's saying someone has to stay here forever." A heavy silence fell over them, the words sinking in like lead. Sam's mind raced, searching for another way, a loophole, anything to avoid what the instructions seemed to demand. But deep down, he knew that curses weren't broken without sacrifice. Jasper's voice broke the silence, laced with anger. "You mean one of us has to stay here? Just rot away in this creepy hole? No way. There's got to be another option." "I don't think there is," Sam replied, his voice strained. "The curse was born here, bound to this place. If we want to break it, we have to give it what it wants." "But who would even?" Nico started, but his voice trailed off as they all looked at each other, the gravity of the decision weighing heavily between them. Sam took a step forward, his heart pounding. He couldn't ask this of anyone else. It was his father's map that had led them here, his determination that had dragged them into the heart of the curse. And if anyone were to pay the price, it should be him. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest. "I'll stay." The others stared at him, stunned. Lena shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Sam, no. There has to be another way." "There isn't," he replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "We came here to break the curse, to save Hollowford. If this is what it takes, then it has to be me." "No," Jasper said, stepping forward, his face twisted with frustration and guilt. "I should be the one. My family's been at the center of this curse for generations. I've spent my whole life running from it, but maybe this is how I make things right." Before anyone could respond, a low rumbling sound filled the room, shaking the walls and sending dust falling from the ceiling. The symbols on the walls began to glow, casting an eerie light over the chamber, illuminating their faces in a ghostly glow. The shadows in the room began to shift, moving as though alive, twisting and writhing around the stone altar. The air grew colder, a deep chill that seemed to seep into their bones, and the sense of malevolence intensified, pressing down on them from all sides. Lena gripped Sam's arm, her voice frantic. "We have to leave. Now. This place, it's waking up." But before they could move, the shadows coalesced around the altar, forming a dark, swirling figure that loomed over them. It had no distinct form, only an outline of darkness and two gleaming eyes that seemed to burn with ancient rage. The voice that filled the chamber was deep and hollow, like a rumble from the depths of the earth itself. "You have come to undo what cannot be undone," it intoned, each word vibrating in their bones. "To end this curse, one must surrender and become part of the darkness." The figure's gaze settled on Sam, and he felt a pull, an urge to step forward, to give in to the darkness. It felt oddly comforting, as though he could let go of everything, fear, pain, even his memories, and fade away into nothingness. He took a hesitant step forward, but Lena grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "No, Sam," she said, her voice fierce. "Don't listen to it." Jasper stepped forward, facing the figure with a determined expression. "If a life has to be given, then take mine. This is my family's legacy, my curse. Let the others go." The shadow seemed to consider him, its eyes narrowing. "The choice has been made," it said, its voice cold and unyielding. "Step forward, and your life will be bound to this place. The curse will be broken, for now." Jasper glanced back at them, a sad smile on his face. "Get out of here. This is where I belong." Before any of them could protest, he stepped onto the altar, his face pale but resolute. The shadow enveloped him, twisting around him like a cloak, and he closed his eyes, his expression peaceful as he faded into the darkness. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the ground beneath them, and the light from the symbols intensified until it was blinding. Sam grabbed Lena and Nico, pulling them back as the walls began to crack, chunks of stone falling around them. "Run!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the collapsing chamber. They scrambled back through the corridors, the shadows chasing them, filling the air with whispers and tendrils of darkness that clawed at their ankles, pulling them back. But they fought on, driven by the urgency of survival and the horror of leaving Jasper behind. They burst through the iron door, stumbling up the stairs as the mill shook, the walls crumbling around them. With a final push, they reached the surface, gasping for air as they collapsed onto the ground outside. The mill groaned, and with a deafening crash, the building caved in on itself, sinking into a dark, silent ruin. The ground settled, the shadows dispersing as the curse took its final offering. The three of them sat in stunned silence, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. Jasper was gone, bound to the darkness, but the curse was broken. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over Hollowford lifting at last. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Sam looked at his friends, their faces etched with grief and relief. They had survived, but the memory of what they had sacrificed would haunt them forever. And as they walked away from the ruins of the mill, they knew that Hollowford's curse had been laid to rest, but the shadows would always be waiting just beneath the surface. Chapter 6: The Weight of Silence. The days after Jasper's sacrifice passed in a blur, a strange silence settling over Hollowford. The town felt lighter, as though a long-held tension had finally released. But to Sam, Lena, and Nico, the emptiness was heavier than ever. They avoided the mill's ruins, the site now a tangled heap of stone and shadowed memories, a silent monument to what they had lost. Sam spent most of his time alone, wandering the quiet streets, or sitting by the creek where he used to go with Jasper. Memories of his friend filled every corner of Hollowford, their shared laughter, the plans they'd made, the stubborn streak that had led Jasper to the altar that night. Sam hadn't slept well since. His dreams were haunted by shadows and the echo of Jasper's final words. One cold morning, Sam found himself standing in front of Jasper's house, unable to move forward, yet unable to turn away. The familiar sight of the broken porch steps, the peeling paint, and the old willow tree in the yard made his chest tighten. Jasper's family didn't know the truth. They'd only heard that he'd gone missing, and though they likely assumed he'd run off as he'd threatened to do so many times, Sam knew the hollow truth. Jasper had given himself up to save Hollowford. The sound of a voice broke Sam's thoughts. "Hey!" He turned to see Lena approaching, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, her face drawn and tired. Nico was a few steps behind, looking just as worn. Without a word, they joined him on the street, the unspoken weight of Jasper's absence settling between them. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night," Lena said softly, her gaze distant. "I keep wondering if there was something we could have done to stop it, to save him." Sam sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know. I keep going over it too, but every time it feels like we didn't have a choice." "But why him?" Nico whispered, his voice catching. "Why did it have to be him?" They fell into silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, the memory of Jasper's final moments pressing on them like an open wound. Sam felt the familiar pang of guilt tightening in his chest. It was his idea to dig up the capsule, his insistence that they pursue the mystery. And though he knew they had no way of knowing what would happen, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible. "We need to do something," Lena said finally, her voice firm. "We can't just move on and pretend nothing happened. Jasper deserves better than that." Sam looked at her, searching her face for understanding. "What do you mean?" "I think we need to tell the truth," she replied, her gaze steady. "To Jasper's family, to the town, they need to know what he did, what he sacrificed." Nico shifted uncomfortably. "But they'll never believe us. We're just kids, and even if we told them everything, who's going to believe a story about curses and sacrifices?" Lena frowned, her determination unwavering. "Maybe they won't, but we owe it to Jasper to try. He didn't just disappear, he saved this town. They need to remember him for that." The three of them exchanged uncertain glances, the enormity of what they were considering sinking in. Telling the truth would mean opening up a part of their lives that no one else could understand. It meant revisiting the darkness they'd barely escaped, facing questions they might never be able to answer. But in the end, it was the only way to honor Jasper's memory. Sam took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Okay, we'll do it. We'll tell his family, and we'll find a way to make the town understand." They spent the rest of the day planning, each of them sifting through memories of that night, piecing together the story they would tell. It wasn't easy, and every word felt like reopening a wound. But they knew they couldn't leave Jasper's sacrifice unspoken. The following evening, they gathered at Jasper's house, hearts pounding as they knocked on the door. Jasper's mother opened it, her face pale and lined with worry. She looked at them with weary eyes, her gaze flickering with a hint of hope that quickly faded as she took in their solemn expressions. "Please come in," she said quietly, stepping aside to let them enter. They settled in the living room, the silence heavy as they struggled to find the right words. Finally, Sam took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper as he began. We need to tell you what happened to Jasper." They told her everything, about the capsule, the curse, the warnings, and the sacrifice Jasper had made to break the cycle. They recounted every detail, each word weighted with the truth of what they had witnessed. At first, she listened in stunned silence, her expression unreadable. But as the story unfolded, her hands trembled and tears filled her eyes. When they finished, she looked at them, her face a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. I don't know if I can believe this, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I know Jasper, and I know he wouldn't have left without a reason. He saved us, Lena said softly, her eyes filled with tears. He saved this whole town. He wanted you to know that. Jasper's mother nodded, her gaze distant. She didn't say anything more, only looked at the three of them as though trying to make sense of the impossible truth they had laid before her. In the end, she only nodded, the unspoken grief hanging between them like a shadow. As they left the house, Sam felt a strange sense of relief mixed with sorrow. They had told the truth, shared Jasper's story with the one person who needed to know, and though it hadn't lifted the weight of loss, it had eased the guilt that had lingered in his heart. Over the next few days, Hollowford began to change. Word spread of Jasper's disappearance, and whispers of what the group had told his mother filtered through the town. Some people believed them, others dismissed it as the wild imagination of teenagers, but no one looked at the ruins of the mill the same way again. The three of them spent more time together, each day a quiet tribute to Jasper's memory. They shared stories, memories, moments of laughter and tears. Hollowford was no longer shrouded in the same darkness, but it would never be the same. The mill's ruins remained a silent reminder of the curse that had once haunted their town, and the friend they had lost to end it. As summer turned to fall, Sam found himself at peace for the first time since that fateful night. He still visited the creek, the quiet spot where he had once spent time with Jasper, and sometimes he would feel a faint presence there, as though Jasper was watching over them, part of the town he had saved. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows over the town, Sam, Lena, and Nico gathered by the creek. They sat in silence, their hearts filled with the bittersweet weight of memory. "Do you think he'd be proud of us?" Lena asked softly, breaking the silence. Sam looked at the water, his reflection rippling in the fading light. He felt a quiet warmth in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady. "I think he would." They sat there as the light faded, sharing a quiet moment of peace and remembrance. And as darkness settled over Hollowford, Sam felt a strange comfort in knowing that some shadows were not meant to be feared, but embraced, as memories, as legacies, as reminders of the strength they had found within themselves and the friend they had lost along the way. In the end, Hollowford's curse was broken, but its story would live on, whispered in the quiet streets and shadowed alleys. And though Sam, Lena, and Nico had faced the darkest parts of their town, they had emerged stronger, bound by the memories of a friend who had become part of the shadows, a protector in the dark. For some, shadows may be feared, but for the three friends who had ventured into the depths of Hollowford's curse, they were a reminder of a light that could never truly fade. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Past. As autumn descended over Hollowford, the town settled into a tentative peace. The whispers about Jasper's disappearance had quieted, fading into the background like the steady hum of the creek or the rustling leaves. People had moved on, but for Sam, Lena, and Nico, the memory of that night remained vivid, etched into their minds like the carvings on the walls of the mill's underground chamber. The three friends began to see Hollowford in a different light, as though Jasper's sacrifice had lifted a veil that once hid the town's true nature. They noticed how shadows fell differently on certain streets, or how the old buildings seemed to carry a quiet, watchful energy. The events of that night had changed everything, and they carried it with them like a second skin, visible only to those who knew where to look. One late afternoon, Sam found himself back at the old graveyard, the place where it had all started. He hadn't meant to go there. His feet had simply carried him, as though something had called him back. The air was cool, filled with the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked headstones. He stood at the spot where they had first dug up the time capsule, the memories flooding back as he stared at the disturbed earth. He could almost see the four of them, digging in the dark, their voices filled with excitement and curiosity before everything had unraveled. Lost in thought, he didn't hear Lena approaching until she was beside him, her presence as quiet as the fading light. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. Her gaze was distant, thoughtful, as she looked out over the graveyard. Feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Sam nodded, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? It's only been a few weeks, but it feels like everything's different. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words settling between them. Finally, Lena turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Do you ever wonder if there's more to it, to the curse? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I keep thinking about that figure we saw, the shadow in the mill. It felt ancient, like it was part of something bigger than just Hollowford. Sam looked down, kicking at the dry leaves that had gathered around his feet. He'd had the same thoughts, the same lingering questions. Yeah, I've wondered about that too, but I don't know if we'll ever really understand. Some things, maybe they're just meant to stay in the dark. Lena nodded, though the spark of curiosity in her eyes didn't fade. Maybe, but I feel like there's a reason we found that capsule. Like, it chose us somehow. Maybe there's more we're supposed to do. Just then, they heard footsteps behind them, and Nico appeared, looking slightly winded as he joined them. You guys just going to hang out in creepy graveyards without me? He asked, forcing a grin. Some friends you are. They chuckled, the laughter easing some of the tension that had been lingering around them. It felt good to laugh, to share a moment of normalcy amidst the memories that haunted them. We were just talking about, well, everything, Lena said, glancing at Sam before looking back at Nico. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to all this. I mean, the curse may be gone, but the past doesn't just disappear. It leaves marks. Maybe there's something here that still needs our attention. Nico raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Let me guess, you want to dig up more creepy secrets? Lena shrugged, but there was a spark in her eyes, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Maybe. I just think maybe we were meant to find more than just a curse. Maybe there's a story here, one that people need to remember. Sam looked between his friends, feeling a strange sense of clarity. He hadn't wanted to revisit the darkness, but as he looked at Lena and Nico, he realized they shared the same need for closure, for understanding. They hadn't just broken a curse, they'd unearthed a legacy, a forgotten history that had shaped their town, their families, and themselves. All right, Sam said, nodding slowly. If there's more to find, then let's find it. Jasper, he didn't go through everything he did just for us to bury it all over again. They left the graveyard with a renewed sense of purpose, their minds buzzing with questions and possibilities. In the days that followed, they began researching Hollowford's history, delving into old records and forgotten stories. They spent hours in the town's small library, sifting through dusty books and faded newspaper clippings, piecing together the fragments of Hollowford's past. They discovered stories of strange occurrences, dating back to the town's founding. Accidents at the mill, mysterious disappearances in the woods, inexplicable fires that had destroyed whole buildings. Each event seemed to echo the dark presence they had encountered, as though the shadows had been woven into the fabric of Hollowford from the beginning. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized that the curse was only part of the story. There were legends of an ancient ritual, a pact made by Hollowford's founders to protect the town from some unnamed threat. It was said that the pact required a sacrifice, a life given every generation to keep the darkness at bay, and somehow that pact had twisted into the curse that had nearly consumed them. One rainy evening, they gathered in Sam's room, their research spread out across the floor. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and ink, and the sound of raindrops tapping against the window filled the room as they pored over their findings. It all goes back to that pact, Lena murmured, tracing a finger over an old newspaper article. The founders made a deal, but something went wrong. They tried to control the darkness, but instead, they trapped it here. And now we're the ones dealing with the fallout. Sam nodded, his mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of the story. Maybe that's why we were chosen. The capsule, it wasn't just a warning. It was a way to finish what the founders started, to end the pact once and for all. Nico glanced at him, a frown creasing his forehead. But why us? Why now? Sam didn't have an answer, but as he looked at his friends, he felt a strange sense of certainty. They were meant to be here, to unravel this mystery and bring Hollowford's story to light. It was as if Jasper's sacrifice had left them with a responsibility, a duty to remember and to protect. "We can't let this disappear," Lena said firmly, her eyes fierce. "The town deserves to know its history, the truth. Maybe it won't change what's happened, but it's better than letting it fade into nothing." And so they made a pact of their own, a promise to carry on Jasper's memory and to ensure that Hollowford's story would not be forgotten. Over the weeks that followed, they documented their journey, writing down every detail, every memory, every fragment of the past they had uncovered. They wrote for themselves, for Jasper, and for the generations that would come after, so that Hollowford's shadows would never again be hidden. On the anniversary of Jasper's sacrifice, they buried their story in a new time capsule, placing it in the same spot where they had unearthed the first. As they covered it with earth, Sam felt a sense of peace, a quiet resolve that he hadn't felt since that fateful night. Standing together in the fading light, they knew they had done what they could. They had uncovered the truth, faced the darkness, and found a way to move forward. And though the shadows would always be a part of Hollowford, they no longer felt like a threat. They were a reminder, a legacy left by those who had come before, and a challenge to those who would come after. As they walked away from the graveyard, Sam felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. For the first time, he didn't fear the shadows. Instead, he embraced them, knowing that they were part of his story, a part of Hollowford's story, forever intertwined with the light. And as the three friends disappeared into the night, their footsteps fading into the quiet of the town, the shadows watched and waited, holding the secrets of Hollowford close, until the day someone else would be brave enough to uncover them once again.